All right, so now I'm going to introduce Bilal Butt, who is a faculty member at the School for Environment and Sustainability. His talk, Drought, Famine, and Hunger in Drylands, and his favorite food is buttered chicken. Thanks, Bilal.
Thank you, Lily, and thank you all for being here. Just want to say a special thank you to the organizers for the opportunity to present some of my food-related themes of my work. But it also seems to me that if we are going to talk about food, then we should talk about hunger and think a little bit about how the lack of food has embodied suffering, and then to examine some of the structural drivers of hunger. And as I go through the next couple of slides, I just want to be cognizant about not falling into some existing tropes about poor Black people in marginal parts of the world who don't have access to food and hunger, and which have become so stereotypically ingrained in our collective imagination and reality that it actually inhibits our way forward for thinking productively about famine and hunger in dryland environments. So with that, globally, the areas that I work in are known as drylands. Obviously, as the name suggests, there's less rainfall. But these are a fairly large percentage of the world's land surface area. It's about 40% of the world's land area. And it's home to about 2 billion people. And so about a quarter of the planet lives in drylands, and about 800 million of which live in sub-Saharan Africa. Their livelihoods, a large proportion of these people's livelihoods are derived from mobile pastoralism, livestock production, livestock raising. And mobility is key to coping with the environmental heterogeneity that characterizes drylands. In other words, you need mobile assets, you need mobile livestock to take advantage of niche forage environments that are not distributed evenly across the landscape, and therefore you have to move in relation to that. Now, one of the things that's happened over the last 50 years has been the erasure of traditional coping strategies for dealing with environmental heterogeneity. There has been the imposition of export-oriented policies and mechanisms, such as taking livestock that pastoralists herd and creating a market for that in the Middle East. And so there's this a huge proportion of sort of live animal export agriculture. And instead of finding ways in which we could maintain traditional coping strategies of mobility, we've started to sort of think about the ways in which you could make it more capital oriented. And this has, of course, been exacerbated by climate change with more frequent droughts. You have much more frequent drought and flooding events. And as a result, you have quite literally hundreds of millions of people in sub-Saharan Africa who are in dire need of food aid today, and with huge amounts of suffering that are occurring in this very moment. So let's try to explain a little bit about why this happens. So first, I want to make clear that drought is not the same as famine, and that's not the same as food insecurity, and rather that these terms have different meanings. They have very different kinds of meanings and are used interchangeably due to a number of different factors. While climate change and export-oriented agricultural policies are exacerbating the effects of environmental variability, many recent changes are being driven by price volatility related to oil prices, as well as, and here please do ask me questions about this later, very racist and colonial understandings of people in drylands and the kinds of helps that are sort of motivated around this question of droughts. It has become ingrained in our imagination that suffering requires external aid, and that external aid has to be related only to money or food in a certain sense. And this is also food that is coming from subsidized agriculture in the American Midwest and elsewhere that is essentially being dumped into areas that have food insecurity. And so as you can see from the FAO Food Commodity Prices Index, that especially over the last 6 months, the prices have skyrocketed completely. And so the price of food is completely out of the reach of many citizens. And so, we need to think a lot about sort of food security in a multidimensional frame, especially with new research that tells us thinking along these 6 planes will help us understand a little bit, not only about what is happening in this moment, but also historically what have been the drivers of food insecurity in drylands. And finally, as you can see in this slide, current national and bilateral aid efforts have focused on buying pastoralist livestock when they're too weak, and dumping the bodies essentially. So the state would get development aid from either the Europeans or the Americans or some other country, and use that money to pay pastoralists, and essentially then dumping the body. Such efforts provide only short-term capital injections. If that, sometimes this money doesn't actually go to the people that actually need it, to these vulnerable households. And it doesn't affect the ability to cope with drought and famine. And so essentially, I would urge us to think a little bit more about how development aid as a solution to hunger and famine in drylands is geared towards the people with the least amount of power, and how we can disrupt some of those narratives and think much more critically about the nature of the problem. Thank you.